According to the Pew Research Center, the Muslim population is growing and is one of the world's fastest growing religious groups. Most Muslims in America are immigrant populations covering people from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia. Given the intersectionality of countries of origin outside of the US, in addition to the practice of Islam, how might we aim to support and be an ally? What are important themes to explore in therapy, and what culturally responsive approaches might we consider? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zun. Our guest today is Dr. Dadouch. She is a Muslim Syrian American licensed psychologist that specializes in the treatment of trauma-related disorders across the lifespan. She is the owner of Sakina Center and adopts trauma-informed, evidence-based therapies to work with children, adolescents, and adults. Dr. Dadouch also has done some research in the area of trauma content exposure in journalism and did her dissertation on the effects of positive expressive writing on PTSD symptomology and well-being. Dr. Dadouch, thank you for joining us today, and Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sand, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Can you walk us through your journey into psychology?
Yeah, it's a journey that goes back to probably middle school. My parents separated and got divorced right around 8th grade, 9th grade. And we were living in Syria at the time. So I was born here, but we moved back for like 10 years, 13 years of my life. My parents wanted us to just be kind of, living in the country we're from and get all those different experiences from living abroad. So they got separated. I think I didn't know it at the time, but we really wanted somebody, an objective person, a psychologist, whatever you call it, to just help us process through the things that we're struggling with and the different familial and the structural changes that we were all going through. And I only realized it probably in high school. I'm like, oh, that person is a psychologist. That's maybe what we needed. I think we knew one psychiatrist from my dad's work. My dad's a physician. And so besides that, there was probably like absolutely no one you could work with. And then the war started. I moved to the US. And right before the war started, I had decided I'm going to study psychology. I really want to study developmental psychology. I really liked kids and working with children. And then after the war, I kind of shifted more towards clinical, learning more about clinical psychology, trauma psychology, things like that. And so that's really what encouraged me to go down this route.
What was that like for you? Because I would imagine, stigma in mental health is a common issue that comes up. So for someone of that age to think about, hey, I really want to talk to somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really tough. I think for me, I had my siblings and they were, I guess we were each other's therapists for a while. I have an older sister and then I have two younger siblings. And so I kind of threw myself in those relationships, taking care of my younger siblings, really spending time with my older sister and her friends and my cousins. And I think we had a really good social support network that really helped us at the time. But it was tough because, sometimes it's your siblings that are causing you your annoyances. Sometimes it's your parents and, you don't want to talk about your parents in a bad way. And so kind of are stuck sometimes. And your friends, you don't always want to kind of talk about what you're going through at school because you're so over it. You're living it at home. And so, yeah, it was tough, but obviously it wasn't that bad. It was fine, but it would have been really nice to have that extra level of support. And so that's really what pushed me to psychology. And, psychology in Syria is, when I told I think she was a high school advisor, I don't know what her role translates to, but she was like, no, Zina, you're too smart for psychology. Do something else. Do medical school. I'm like, no, I don't want to do medical school. I always, everyone goes to that route. So even the idea of studying psychology was so looked down upon. Like, no, that's just for people who don't get to study anything serious. That's kind of like an easy way out for college. They had the major, but it was so looked down upon as a career.
Given that your training took place here, from your lens, do you notice any differences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that psychology in the US is and very individualistic. So you're the person, even conceptualizing cases, you have your thoughts, your feelings, your situations, and that's it. You don't really consider a lot of other factors that may be very important in who you are. And so coming from a collectivist society, I think a lot of the times it's really hard to kind of discard those other factors that come with being a full person and just focus on kind of 2 3 aspects in conceptualization and in treatment. I don't necessarily know how psychology is like studied back home or studied in Middle Eastern countries or even collectivist societies, and whether they change anything in what we learn here in the US and Canada, let's say. But I imagine that even if they adopt the same models and everything, it must be different in some ways, whether it's including, let's say, religion a little more, whether it's including your family a little more, whether it's including different values or just emphasizing different values than perhaps we would here in the US can be kind of a big difference.
Well,
A lot
how are you doing it right now with your clients?
actually have some clients that are international. I have a few clients in Egypt, and it's first of all, it's very interesting doing therapy in a different language than the one that you're trained in. And secondly, I think there's so much more emphasis on, at least with this particular clients, on religion and religious faith and beliefs. And that sometimes the session feels a little bit like, I'm less of a therapist and more of kind of a person just sharing their religious beliefs and kind of talking about those things in a way that I don't always have an opportunity to do with people in the US. And to give you context, this person has lost her husband in a really tragic accident, and she hasn't told her kids yet. And her kids are kind of sensing that something is off, and so a lot of her reasons are that, well, he's missing, he's not officially found from this accident, and so she thinks that God is great, and you never know, like he could be alive. And so a lot of our conversations are about that type of beliefs. And yeah, sure, God is great, and at the same time you have this evidence, it's been this much time, it was a really terrible accident, they've searched and searched and can't find him. And from my therapeutic lens, I find myself struggling, like, well, is it okay to be hopeful with her, because my religious beliefs may tell me, yeah, that's right, he may be alive, like who knows, God is capable of anything. Or at the same time, I'm like, but just logically, evidence-based, like this cannot be the case, like it's been too long for somebody to still be alive and not hear from him or find him or anything like that. And so if I were just to stick to my CBT training, I have no idea how I would handle this case or how I would deal with it, and what I would categorize as pathological beliefs or things that are just too, kind of not denial necessarily, but just living in a state that's disconnected with reality. And so these really subtle differences, or maybe not so subtle, but differences that I've been noticing with different clients, US based versus international. And I think it may not be the case that everyone abroad may depend on their religious beliefs so much in a therapy context as opposed to somebody living here, but it's been noticeable for sure.
Who are most of the clients that are seeking you out for treatment?
Right now, it's mostly Arab speaking Muslim clients. It's really hard to find an Arab speaking therapist in the US or an Arab speaking psychologist if you're seeking a psychologist. I only know two in my entire journey of psychology so far. I only knew two doctorate level psychologists who speak Arabic. I know some master's levels, but most of the master's level therapists I know still are Muslim but are not Arab, so they don't speak Arabic. And so I think that's a big driver for folks, is that they're looking for somebody to speak Arabic with. I have a couple clients who speak both, they're bilingual, but they tell me, like, in no way I can express these things in English. So I'm so glad, that you speak Arabic and that you're comfortable enough to do therapy in Arabic. And I relate to that. Sometimes I'm expressing my deepest thoughts and feelings. I'm like, I don't know which language I prefer. Sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that.
What are some of the most common situations or common disorders? What are some of the common challenges that you've been working with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's see, a lot of trauma and trauma work. Other themes are probably kind of adjusting to changes, adjusting to moves, adjusting to move to the US or moves to different states. Most of them have never had therapy before, which I've found to be an interesting pattern.
You're speaking to clients who are Arabic. Please correct me. Is it Arabic or Middle Eastern? Like, I'm confused,
Yeah,
honestly.
you're right to be confused. It's very confusing for even Arabs sometimes, but the Middle East is a part of the Arab world, but the Arab world is more than just the Middle East. So you have North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, those countries in North Africa are not Arab countries only. They have other ethnic minorities in there, like Berber in Morocco, for example. And in Egypt, there's a lot of different ethnic groups. So they're technically considered Arab countries, but they're not the Middle East. The Middle East is just Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Lebanon, Turkey. So those are kind of the Asian side, and then you have the North African side. What binds us together is that the Arabic language is our main language spoken in that country. And so that's kind of what constitutes an Arab country. But then you have a lot of different Arab dialects and Arab accents, and sometimes an Egyptian client may say something that I don't necessarily know or say, and I would have to inquire. So, but yeah, generally speaking, Arab countries are those where the main language spoken is Arabic. And then you have in the US, a lot of Muslim clients come to you seeking therapy that are Pakistani, Indian, East Asian. And so those countries don't speak Arabic, they have their own other languages. And so they may seek a therapist that speak their language, or they're just maybe okay with English. But when I say I've been having a lot of Arabic speaking clients, I've had Egyptian, I've had Lebanese, I've had Syrian. And so they're kind of from the Middle East, North African area.
I would imagine that in research, it can be very challenging trying to categorize and analyze this population group.
It's unfortunate, and this is a part of why we don't know how many of us live in the US, is that they've categorized Middle Eastern individuals as white ever since kind of census. It started happening early in the census stages. There were Middle Easterns in the United States. Either the Middle Easterns wanted to be categorized as white because, that's where all the power was, or there was some other historical context that I'm unfamiliar with. But regardless of the reason, we are categorized as white. And there is this movement to start a Middle Eastern North African, it's kind of we call it a MENA. So a MENA category on the census, just so that we know how many of us are out there in this country, what our needs are, where do we live, etc. This last census, it didn't go through. I think there's the efforts are still ongoing to include it in the next census or in the future census, because we really don't know. Similarly with Muslims, like how many Muslims are in the country, we don't know. Census doesn't ask about religious affiliation. And so there's an estimate of 3 million to 7 million, which is a really large range. So we know for sure that there's a lot of us out in the US, but the exact numbers are unknown.
I'm also curious about your work with expressive writing. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you incorporate that into treatment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was really interested in expressive writing in my dissertation research. I stumbled upon expressive writing in my kind of lit searches and was really interested in how little the dose needed to be for it to be really effective. Baker is the researcher who developed it, and he would just ask participants to write about what's bothering them, what an event that bothered them in the past, event that's going on right now, and just freely express yourself. And he would do it one time and kind of measure people a month later on different symptoms. He would do it multiple times, and then he would kind of play around with the dose. And he found that writing 2 to 3 times with time apart between them has consistently just decreased symptoms of PTSD and depression, and even in cancer patients or a lot of other illnesses, decrease some of their physical somatic complaints. And so I thought it would be a really cool thing to test out with a little twist that's been tested before, but not as much, which to have a neutral kind of write about whatever is bothering you, and there's no direction in there, as opposed to another type of task, which is more specific on thinking about your trauma for a few minutes, and then to write about what happened because of that experience in terms of growth, change in yourself. What did you learn from it? How did you become a better, stronger person from it? So there's a little more guidance in the instructions to get you to think in a more positive way about what came out of the most difficult time of your life, or one of the most terrible things you can go through. And it was really great running that experiment. The neutral valence, super easy. They would never ask me anything, kind of would just write it down. I would leave them, obviously come back, and super straightforward. The positive valence, they would always be like, there was like a pause that they would have right before I would leave them. And then a couple of them they were obviously crying when I would come back, which was always interesting because I didn't notice it ever, with the neutral valence group. Seemed to have triggered something in people in a way that the neutral valence just didn't. And that's a lot of the theoretical basis of the positive task, is that it helps your neural networks connect in a little bit of a different way than the neutral valence would. And it encourages you to think about your experiences in a different light and in a positive light, even though it may have been a really awful, terrible thing that happened. And the findings were that both groups improved over the time that we measured them, which was a month, on their PTSD symptoms. Not one group did better than the other. They both did just as well, which was exciting. I've been really interested in it since, is kind of tying a little bit with religious views that we have in Islam about that things happen for a reason. And there's a verse that says, surely with hardship comes ease. So there's always something that is going to be for your betterment or for the better of your life, even though you may not see it yet, even though it may not be very obvious, even though it may take years for you to realize it. But every hardship comes with something that's going to be beneficial. That tied really closely with my dissertation, and also trauma work in general. There's a lot of interest in post-traumatic growth, and people have a really hard time defining what that means. But there is this idea out there in the trauma world that we may benefit from our traumas in ways that we don't understand just yet.
So how are you using, first of all, that sounds like an amazing study to be able to something like that and obtain this qualitative response, because as you were saying, the outcome both benefited. However, there is a specific quality that was very unique and different. Now, how have you applied some of these ideas?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the work that's already a part of trauma-focused CBT, which is the child, adolescent, or evidence-based trauma treatment out there, that's mostly used. I think it's the main therapy that's used for trauma work for anyone under 18, is that they do a really beautiful kind of series of different chapters of the therapy. At first you learn your skills, your practice skills, you learn relaxation, emotional regulation theories, and then you start actually the exposure part, which is when you write your narrative. And so depending on the age of the kiddo and how old and expressive they are, and are they verbal, can they write, all these things. You want to write something like a product, whether it's maybe a magazine and they draw on it, or it's an actual writing piece. It may be a little book if you're a teenager and you'd like to write a lot or say a lot. And in that narrative, they have different chapters of their life. So first, tell me a little bit about yourself, and then we move on to tell me about your trauma. And it takes many weeks. Obviously, this is not a one-day product. And after all these weeks, we kind of go back and reassess some of their stuck points, what we call stuck points in adult therapy, but one of their kind of flash points in their traumas. Maybe they have a distortion here and there. Maybe they're misremembering their trauma. Maybe they're attributing blame to themselves or other people in the wrong way. And so we kind of go back and edit the writing that they did until they're reprocess a lot of what they used to believe about their traumas and what happened and how it's impacted them. And then the narrative or the exposure part ends with this really beautiful future focus, just what's coming next in my life. And then a part of that is where it ties to expressive writing, is You ask them to write about how it's made them stronger, how it's made them a better person, how it's prepared them for a better future. This life is full of traumatic experiences and stress. We can never stop that. We can never control that. And so, but how did this experience prepare you to face future traumas? So it's a really beautiful, laid out way for our adolescents and kiddos to be able to think in a positive way about what happened to them after processing it. And also this kind of Islamic value of, with everything that's tough, where I'm going to benefit somehow from it. And regardless, obviously, this is the evidence-based treatment. So regardless if your patient's Muslim, client's Muslim or not, it's kind of something you include in there in your work, nicely tied with a lot of those other things. So that's really for kind of child adolescent work. For adult work, it's a little more, you kind of have to go there with them. I've known people or therapists who do it. Regardless, they've been that type of researcher and clinician that's interested in post-traumatic growth. Your trauma work, tie it in for them and discuss it with them just like you would for the child treatment protocol. But it is interesting that it's missing from the adult world, because I think adults are just as capable of thinking about it in a positive way if you guide them to that as kids are.
Yeah, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking through how sometimes the existing work that we have for trauma treatment, it almost doesn't quite feel complete.
Mhm.
And it seems like you're adding this tail end of the package. You have the skill set. How do we acknowledge that traumatic events may or may not happen? We can't control that. But really, the focus is about how do you process it in a way that creates greater meaning for you? How do you grow out of this experience?
Mhm.
And you're giving them that skill. It
Yeah.
also gives us a lens to how you conceptualize people. They have the capability for growth.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, as a Middle Eastern individual or a Middle Eastern psychologist, what were some of the challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share with us?
I am a privileged individual in a lot of different areas of my life. And so a lot of what you may call struggles of a person of color or struggles of minorities, generally in the United States, I have not necessarily experienced those things. But I think a really common theme, I would say across a lot of minority groups, people of color, ethnic and racial minorities, is that we are not represented in a lot of the spaces that we're in, and we're often the only person of our group in a room or on a table or in a certain space. And that's not easy. I think when you have representation and then you don't, you're like, oh, this is really off. Like, I'm suddenly the representation of 2 billion people across the world, 2 billion Muslims. I'm like the only Muslim in the room. I'm the only Muslim in class. I'm the only Muslim in practicum. I'm the only Muslim in all these internship and postdoc programs. And so there's a lot of weight put on you, especially for me. I think if you're a Muslim but not so visibly Muslim, you may pass kind of okay. You may just be considered just a regular, maybe white person, because I am white passing, I think, without my headscarf or my hijab, but I stick out. And so people just ask a lot of questions, and the questions are good, but they always come with a little bit of pressure that I must answer in the perfect way, because whatever I say is going to be put as like the facts. And so training purposes, I think a difficulty a lot of minorities have is that training is very white focused, because researchers are mostly white individuals, developers of treatments are mostly white individuals, and a lot of white females. White females are biggest population in psychology. And so for us to start changing some of those things, we have to just have more representation in those spaces. And my hope is that this becomes a less common experience for folks. And every time I hear a Muslim college student wanting to study psychology, I'm like, yes, go for it. You got to do it. And there are more master's levels therapists that are Muslim that I've just noticed. It just tends to be the easier route, which makes a lot of sense. PhD or doctorate route is too much work sometimes. And so But it's still great to see, and I'm hoping that we'll continue to increase in that representation. But it also needs to be on not just students, it needs to be faculty, it needs to be directors of internships and directors of clinical programs, and just diversity across the board for us to feel more comfortable and represented, and for our values and beliefs to be kind of normalized.
Yeah, to see that play out at the leadership level. And also, thank you very much for sharing your challenges, thinking about the weight of your responses when someone asks you a question. It's like you represent, like you said, the entire 2 million, 2
You
billion,
know, 2
2
billion
million,
Muslims across the world, 2 billion, yeah.
2 billion. Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
Yeah, and
Wow.
we're all Muslims are so heterogeneous. It's it's wild. Like you're coming from tens of different countries, and each country has so many different. Every country's has a lot of different groups within it, and then different languages and different traditions. And but what ties a lot of Muslims together is their religion. But a lot of other things are incredibly different, and so it's really hard to be a representative of even like a Syrian Muslim, because there's no such thing. We are so different even within each country. And there's different sects of Islam, and then so it's very complicated. But it doesn't matter, because you're seen as, well, you're the only Muslim here, so we just take your word as the be all word for representation.
For someone who is either working with a Muslim or Middle Eastern client, what would you recommend that they consider or do?
People may assume, oh, the religion is a lot of acts of worship. And yes, it includes acts of worship, but it's so much more than that. And so to kind of shift the narrative you may have been given from media, news, whatever it may be, to kind of work on changing that within yourself, is that, yeah, we have those acts of worship, but a lot of what guides us are our values and morals. And examples of those are loyalty, family, religion, knowing how to balance a lot of things that may be contradictory, let's say, to Islamic values, while living in the United States or while living in a non-Muslim country. And that's the reason a lot of us are so tied to our communities, because you need someone that looks like you, that acts like you, that believes like you. Otherwise, it's really hard to live everyday life. And so for a lot of therapists, they may see that someone has a huge community, a Muslim community that they're a part of, and may not understand why they still feel lonely, or they may still feel that something is missing. And so just because you have a community that you're really tied to doesn't necessarily mean you feel you have right friendships, or you have the right companionships, or you're not being able to find a partner that you can find, because we just throw ourselves in those communities, because otherwise you're really alone. And our communities are really important to us, but our communities are also very heterogeneous. And so there may be things that may seem contradictory to somebody who's looking, who's an outsider looking in. It's like, why do you have so much depression and anxiety when you have such large communities, and communities are so important to you? So kind of understanding the nuances can be very helpful. And it's really hard. And it's not easy work to be an ally. We know this, but it's important for us to just be allies for each other, and help fill in the gaps that are very needed. So that's kind of where I would start, just getting to know more about the religion, not from sources that are kind of news and media. People who work in mosques, like religious leaders, or what we call imams, are really, really open for people to come and talk to them, ask them questions, consult with them. So that's another tip, is that be on your own in navigating therapy with a Muslim client.
What is something you would recommend to therapists or faculty members who is working with a Muslim client or trainee?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And generally speaking, knowing the religion of Islam is a very global religion, it's really important to recognize that Muslim clients and trainees and individuals are just going to come from a lot of complex, different cultural backgrounds. And all of these things, together with the religious aspect, are going to play a role in making them who they are, identifying their values and their characteristics. So it'd be very helpful to start with that caveat. Like, we're all going to we're going to look different, we're going to be different. But what binds us is that religion aspect. And so knowing that more about the religion would be very helpful. The 5 tenets of Islam would be helpful to know. your general knowledge on just prayers and fasting once a year in Ramadan. Those are really the most impactful on day-to-day life for practicing Muslims. And then we have our really large value system that drives a lot of our daily decisions. And that's going to differ person to person. But that's why, as a therapist, you should identify what part religion plays in each client's life. And then from there, help them identify what values they hold, what values their religion drives, what values their, let's say, life in the US drives, and how do they combine together or how do they clash together. And so, just like you would with any other client, any identity that they hold dear to them, you would incorporate in therapy. Similarly to this, if the religion aspect is something that their family's Muslim, maybe they're not very practicing, maybe you don't need to do so much of that work. But if they identify it as something very important to them and it's a value that they uphold, then taking that further step of talking more about and identifying what role it plays in their daily life. And then, using those values that are a huge part of our religion can really give windows into incorporating these values in your therapeutic approach or in your training or in your teaching or whatever it may be. One common example that we see because you mentioned training universities, let's say a Muslim student or a Muslim work employee who's practicing, and then their practice and values abstain from alcohol. So it's oftentimes you find it very difficult to join different social activities in college or at work where the entire activities around alcohol, and they may feel isolated or they may feel anxious about hanging out around certain types of activities. And so to just keep that in mind, if you don't know that you abstain from alcohol, if you're practicing Muslim, then you wouldn't know that this may be an issue. So just having that knowledge base would be incredibly helpful.
I really actually love the example you gave about the training experience when sometimes training programs have these social opportunities and they may be at a social hour, which is happy hour,
Right.
a common thing.
Yeah.
And I wonder what it would be like if we change happy hour so that it is a different type of activity, or if we do invite trainees who are Muslim to maybe just check in with them when they do show up,
Mhm.
just to see how they're doing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, from my experience in grad school and in internship and postdoc, you're right. A lot of it is happy hour. And even if it's not a happy hour, it would be gathering at a sports bar or at another type of bar. And I was the only Muslim in school, in class. And I wanted to go and I wanted to have a community with my grad school cohort. So I would go, and I know other people who wouldn't. And so that's where you would see the difference between different people. I consider myself practicing and I hold religion dear to my heart. And still, I decided, you know what, it's more important for me to build that community and I'm not spending as much time and whatever it is. And so, yeah, you may find someone who may also hold religion dear to their heart, just as I do, but they wouldn't go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Tadush, do you have a couple of final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
I think what I would love to end with is, yeah, thanking everybody who's interested in this work because it is not easy to become an ally. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of effort, but to know how valuable that work would be and that we cannot do this on our own as Muslim therapists. We really need allies to help us fill in those gaps. Most therapists I know who are Muslim have a full caseload, they have a long waiting list. And forget about the language piece, if we're just talking a client who's speaking English, who wants therapy, everyone listening to this podcast can really be a person to help fill in that gap with just a little bit of extra work, a little bit of extra research and learning and growth. And then you can feel more comfortable to work with people of, let's say, a Muslim background or a religious background. And for Muslims who may be listening, to seek out therapists that may not be Muslim, because again, as opposed to waiting for 3, 4, 5, 6 months, maybe it's all right to try working with a therapist who's not Muslim and see how it goes, to be willing to try different things also. It's wonderful if one wants to try therapy and you don't want them to have a bad experience, but the assumption that I'm always going to have a bad experience if I still have a non-Muslim therapist is also not fair and not true. And so to be okay with trying something new.
Well, Dr. Tadush, thank you very much for your clinical insight into working with Muslim clients and the allyship that we can pursue as part of our work. Again, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology.